Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host as always, Steve Hall, and we have another exciting roundtable again with Eric Helms, Menno Henselmans, and Mike Israetel. And today we're talking again about hypertrophy, of course, and we're going to be talking about volume, intensity, and frequency and how to practically apply those to yourself for hypertrophy and within your program. So to kick things off, I'm going to give it over to Eric Helms, who's going to kind of define each of these. And then Menno will talk about practical application, how he does that for his clients and himself. So if you want to take the floor, Eric.
Sure. So volume, intensity, and frequency, I think probably the biggest variables we need to pay attention to are global variables, if you will. Volume is the total amount of work you do, and how you define it is actually kind of this problem that we're going to continue having for a little bit longer in the fitness field, I think. It has been defined as sets times reps times load, or tonnage, which is the actual amount of weight you're lifting. If you are looking at it in scientific literature, like the true calculation of work will include the range of motion traveled and involves more physics calculations that aren't relevant or rather realistic for what we do in the gym. In terms of meta-analyses and systematic reviews looking at volume, they have looked at the total reps performed in a given period of time, and also the total number of sets in a given period of time. One shortfall of this, but also interesting finding, is that most of the research done for hypertrophy is training to failure. So it's always comparing, which is useful, and that it's a fixed intensity of effort all the time, comparing sets. And it allows us to potentially put sets on equal footing regardless of the repetition range based on our new findings, or I'd say confirmed findings over the last decade, that if a set is pushed to an adequate intensity after a certain rep range, it's probably quite similar in terms of stimulus. Let's say 8 reps or more. If you're doing an 8 rep set or maybe a 25, 30 rep set, they might have a similar level of stimulus because the aggregate tension and stimulus that you would get would be the same once you've worked your way through all that volume and done the final few reps or gotten close to them. So I think counting volume is as simple as counting hard sets for hypertrophy if you're working in that rep range. However, if you're looking at lower rep ranges, if you're kind of doing a power building routine, or if you're using the 1 to 6, 1 to 8 RM range, it might be more useful to look at total reps in that zone. But for the most part, I think you can look at total number of hard sets. That's the hard definition out of the way. Frequency is just how many, for hypertrophy, I would say the best definition is how many times you train each muscle group per week. And then finally, intensity, there's 2 types: intensity of effort, intensity of load. So there is the actual weight on the bar relative to what you can do. And then there is how close you take each set to failure, which would be RPE or RIR.
Perfect. No, I think that was fantastic. And yeah, volume is always kind of the joker of the pack. And I know there's coming out new ways to kind of think about these things like effective reps and things. So no, fantastic, Eric. And I'll hand it over to Menno to kind of talk about how you might practically apply each of these for hypertrophy. I guess that might be quite a long way. A long answer, but you can delve into it as you like.
I'll try to keep it as concise as possible. I fully agree with Eric's definitions. Those are also the main ones I use, or how I define them when I work with clients. And I think for intensity, the main application is that there was this idea that there's this hypertrophy zone of 6 to 12 reps. And if you go outside that, you lose out on gains. And it seems to be more like 3 to 30 reps instead of 6 to 12. And even then, it's debatable. So the latest research, one good study by Brad Schoenfeld, suggests that as long as you go to about 40% intensity and you go close to failure, or ideally to failure, if you're using such a low load probably, then you get a similar hypertrophic response regardless of intensity. And with the 85+% range, you may need to compensate by doing more sets because your repetition volume is so low. So there the definitions sort of merge a bit, whether you should use total reps or total sets. But within the say 5 to 20 range or something is pretty safe to go by sets rather than reps. And in terms of application, that means we should look at other criteria mostly for the determination of rep ranges than just is this good for muscle growth. So we do know higher intensities are better for strength development, so that's one factor. What remains to be investigated is if strength gains translate into greater hypertrophy gains in the future, which is something I do think is true, but it seems to be a pretty small effect if there is one. Because we do know that you get, if you're stronger, you can apply more mechanical tension on the muscle fibers and you achieve greater levels of muscle activation. So at least it's plausible that this would translate in the long term to greater hypertrophy if it allows you to perform more volume or reach higher levels of muscle activation. There's also some research, scant research, I should say, 2 studies, 2 trends, not even statistical significant ones, that suggest there is benefit to using multiple rep ranges instead of just one. And there is also research that it depends on your individual genotype whether you respond better to lower or higher reps. So that's where things get very tricky, and where I think it may still matter for some individuals if you go higher or lower reps. And that we have 2 great studies, the Bevan study and one about the ACE genotype that show that certain individuals respond better to higher reps or more sets, whereas others don't. There's also research at certain non-responders, for example, which is in endurance training, but probably similar. People that don't seem to get any gains from a certain volume do get the same level of development as the normal responders from a higher volume. So there you have those applications, which is a take-home message for me is that you want to apply multiple rep ranges. And what I do is I use a percentage system. So what many people do is they prescribe reps, or powerlifting programs you typically see intensity times weight. So you're going to do 3 reps with 80% of your 1RM. But I actually prescribe the proximity to failure and the percentage, which I think is a nice way to auto-regulate the reps, because you have some individuals when you tell them, the range is like 3 to 30 reps, and you have them do 30 reps. But some individuals actually go below the ideal intensity range at 30 reps, because they, even if you do have them work out with 50% of their max, they can only do like 12 reps. So, but it's actually still scientifically debatable if you should use reps or intensity to define the lower end of the intensity range. And there's injury potential. Lower reps, higher intensities are much more injurious, much more stress on the connective tissue in general compared to the same volume of higher reps. Volume-wise, I like to use hard sets, as Eric said as definition. Defining an optimal number here is tricky. I think the individual variability is so large and the endpoint not so well established yet that I typically answer it's 10 to 30 sets per week per muscle group. And that's a pretty damn broad range, but it depends on so many factors, because we know that training to failure, for example, increases the recovery time of, I think it was normally 48 hours, and then when they train to failure, it was like 72 hours on average. Or it was actually 24 and 48, so it actually doubles the recovery time on average, I think. And then
some
there's
markers
sleep.
are 72.
Yeah. So there's sleep, stress, gender. Women seem to recover faster. How advanced you are. Trained muscles seem to be more resistant to muscle damage and have a higher regenerative potential. So I typically, based on these factors, I put someone within that 10 to 30 range. And super hard gainers, like people with very bad compliance, low quality diets as well, I may put them on the low end, like 8, maybe even 8 sets or something, but I rarely go below 10 if someone is interested in optimizing and truly maximizing the rate of muscle growth. Frequency, I'm not as a high frequency guy now, because I popularized the idea that, I would say consider myself a bit like what Martin Birkin did for meal frequency, is that he showed a lot of people that there's an alternative way to go about programming, and it turned out to be not more effective, but at least equally effective. And it may be more effective to go with higher than traditional frequencies for in elite lifters at least, because all the research where we do find like significant benefits or very strong trends, like the Hartman study, the infamous Norwegian frequency project, and that's all very elite lifters. So at that level, it may become beneficial to go to frequencies of 3+ per week per muscle group. And research is quite firm, I'd say, quite established that you need at least 2, for most trained individuals, 2 sessions per week. One is going to be the true bottom end for basically anyone, I'd say. And there is a range there. So volume is definitely the key one, and frequency impacts volume. So that's definitely an important one. If you change your frequency, you will almost inevitably in practice affect your training volume, because what many people do, for one instance, is they think high frequency training is about the total amount of times you're in the gym instead of the total amount of times you train a muscle group. So they have a certain program of 4 days a week and they're going to do high frequency training. They do that program, but 6 times. And then they actually basically multiply their volume by 150%. So that will certainly affect your progression, but mostly because of the change in volume instead of the change in frequency. But even if you split, say, Monday's workout of quads work and of leg presses, squats, and leg extensions, and you split that out over Monday, Wednesday, Friday, then you're going to do more volume, because normally if you do leg extensions after the squats and the leg presses, you're fatigued, so your repetition volume is a lot lower. But whereas if you do the leg extensions separately on Friday, you're going to do more reps, so you're doing a higher volume. And that may also affect your progression, I think. Although actually a recent study that did not equate for volume this way, did not find a statistically significant advantage of the higher frequency protocol, but it was a very weird program with the same exercise performed 5 days in a row to failure, I think. And statistical power was probably a concern. So I would say that if you increase volume, regardless of mechanism, whether it's by rest intervals or training frequency or almost any kind of mechanism, more volume up to the point that you can recover and supercompensate for it means more muscle growth.
Perfect. No, I think that was a great kind of summary of your a very broad summary, because obviously individualization is huge. So you kind of talked about the 10 to 30 sets in terms of volume, focusing on a range of repetitions, more so kind of 6+ repetitions, and then going up to maybe 30, but making sure those higher repetitions are closer to failure. You didn't touch on relative intensity, Menno. I don't know if you've got any kind of ideas behind relative intensity, whether you kind of stay away from failure or push that very often.
Right. So proximity to failure, as I often like to call it, not to confuse it with efforts like RPE or because RPE, depends on the definition you give it.
I've heard that one's pretty good too. Yeah,
I typically use reps to failure. But it's sort of the same thing. It only diverges. It only diverges if you're talking about 0 repetitions in reserve. Is that you're actually going to failure, or is that you could not do any more reps, but you have completed all your reps? That's why I don't like repetitions in reserve. It's like the 0 one is the vague one for me.
It's hard being that pedantic. I understand.
Yeah. But anyway. I think that training to failure, basically what the research, the nice ones are 2 studies that basically look at training to failure, same volume, not training to failure, and same set count, not to failure, which means less volume. And then you find training to failure does benefit muscle growth, and strength development actually super weak trends, probably very negligible benefits, especially because your technique is bound to break down. But there seems to be a benefit for muscle growth. And it's mainly because of the extra volume you're doing, but it comes with very significant extra increase in recovery need. So I typically stay 1 to 3 reps away from failure to optimize that ratio of muscle stimulation to fatigue. And if someone's in the gym like 2 times a week, then I just say, go to failure, man, because recovery is not going to be your issue. But if you're training every day full body or something, and you're a bodybuilder that's pushing everything to the limit, you probably don't want to do everything to failure, because you're going to burn out really quick.
Perfect. And Mike, have you got any kind of different thoughts on what Menno's said? Do you practically apply that any differently?
Yeah, one thing I want to point out is that a lot of the studies comparing failure to non-failure training it's really hard to figure out if it's the failure that made the difference, because one problem is, from my reading of the literature, almost all of the studies give a volume that is usually significantly below the midpoint of that 10 to 30, even the 10 to 20 range. You basically know these people are being underdosed. And then the failure condition basically results in usually, like Menno said, a little bit more strength, quite a bit more not quite a bit, but more hypertrophy. And, is that because that they're just getting closer to what I would call their maximum adaptive volume or stimulus? Like, it's just like less left in the tank, and the other people are leaving way ton of the tank. So I think because it's really difficult to study, it's going to take a while to really figure that out from a science perspective. Luckily, in practice, we already know a lot about it. So what you would need is you would need to take individuals either across a broad range of volumes, or really find what I would term their maximum recoverable volumes, get sort of close to those in training, and then compare failure training versus non-failure training with what would really be a challenging, taxing, and real-world volume, right? Something like a business volume. Because if you're doing 8 sets per week per body part, and one of the conditions is 4 reps from failure, one is 2 failure, I mean, I would, if I was doing 8 sets per week only for all the body parts, I'd go to failure too, like Menno said. I mean, this recovery is not a limiting factor, but that study supposition that recovery is not a limiting factor is an absurd supposition for transfer to most lifters that would listen to your podcast, Steve, or would subscribe to the 3DMJ newsletter, et cetera. Most of those folks are looking for, like, they're ready to put in the work, and they're doing a lot of stuff. And for them, real world recovery is in fact a concern. And that's where failure training really starts to come in and show some disadvantages. I think to all of us here in practice, I don't want to speak for anybody, but like, people, you hear some interesting recommendations every now and again for you well-meaning evidence-based folks that say, like, on the big compound movements, but you don't want to go to failure, but on the accessories, you can just go to failure all the time. Some people say, like, you can go to failure or not, it doesn't matter because of the studies. We get, like, in a beginner, untrained individuals who train at half of their volume capacity, sure. But for folks training hard, especially the more advanced you get, I mean, like, for me, at my current level of development, wave my own advanced flag, a set to true muscular failure would be a religious experience, like one set. I mean, you guys ever see someone go to failure on the leg press, like true failure with 600 pounds? But there's some shit you don't want to see every day, and you don't want to be that person. So, I mean, that's a huge amount of fatigue. And we know that it doesn't yield. It yields maybe 10% more growth per unit of volume, but the fatigue is, I don't know, in my estimate, maybe double or something like that. So the training to failure thing is something that if you try it and you start to get more intermediate and more experience, you will very quickly realize that this whole idea that, but you can train to failure or not, it doesn't matter, that shit just goes right out the fucking window. What you end up doing is, if you're really ideologically committed to training to failure all the time, like high intensity training people, you end up trading a shitload of volume off for the ability to train. Bodybuilders at a high level who do hit, which are very few of them, end up doing like 1 or 2 working sets per body part because they simply can't recover from anymore. That's a very different question of, can they benefit from more if they reduce the reps in reserve? I would say the answer is almost certainly yes, because the link between volume and hypertrophy versus the link between failure and hypertrophy, I'd bet the volume, any way you could add more volume still sticking in a decent RIR would be a better trade-off for most people. And never mind the injury trade-offs. I mean, holy shit. The closer you get to failure, especially the more high level you get, you're just rolling the dice on that shit as far as injury is concerned. With everything else, and I suppose I'm not even contradicting Menno, but everything else Menno said is right on the money, and Eric as well. I usually do the 10 to 20 sets, but that's like fucking the 20s is from my experience working with people, and I think that's actually for males. I do 10 to 20, and I am kind of doing that thing where, like, look, if I was wrong and it's really 25 is the average maximum recoverable volume, okay, people find that anyway because I give instructions as to how to find that. But I don't want to recommend 35 as the average MRV and have just people just fall out of the sky like Icarus all the time and be like, Dr. Mike said, and then I blew my arm off. And I think females have, in my view, an MRV of somewhere between 5 and 10 sets per week higher than males from my training experience. I mean, it's like significantly. Like if you're, one of the things I say, if you're a male and you're writing programs, especially for smaller female lifters that have been training a while, so their work capacity is high, but maybe genetically just not super strong, you'll write programs as far as volume that look like a mistake to you. You're like, there's no fucking way you're doing 10 sets of chest every other day. And they're like, yep, not sore, recovering great, making great gains. And I was like, okay, I guess I just got to write that down. So I think the cool thing about understanding all this from a theoretical basis, like the guys mentioned, is if you only approach things from your own practical experience, you're going to approach things like you approach them, which is good for your physiology, et cetera. But if you approach it from an evidence-based perspective, then you can realize that some shit that you program will look pretty fucking weird to you. But if the numbers work out and if the person's recovering and they're making progress, the variation is really high.
Perfect. And Eric, have you got any comments on that? And if you don't, you can talk about kind of where you think periodization within all of this comes.
Yeah, I really don't have a lot to add to that. We could anecdote or go off on sideways track about why women can do more volume or discuss RIR, but I don't think we need to. So periodization, I think I really like the really, really simple definition from Buford 2007. It just means changing variables over time. I like to use a more simple definition when we're talking hypertrophy, because I think complex periodization is really not needed. It's more about just fatigue management and intelligent distribution of training and then progression, right? So in practice, what I do with periodization with clients, well, first I'll start with the literature. Right now, we don't have great data on periodization for hypertrophy because very few study designs are designed to maximize hypertrophy. At best, you see them designed to maximize hypertrophy within the context of what the researchers and the participants are willing to commit to the lab time. So that might be like the best 3-day, 1-hour split we can do. Which is very useful for any serious fitness person who wants hypertrophy, or like personal trainers who you're never going to get your client in there more than 3 times a week for an hour. And if it does, it's rare. So not that that's not useful, but that we don't have great hypertrophy program like periodization comparisons. So the meta-analysis we have showing that it really doesn't matter whether or not or how you periodize training for hypertrophy. It's more of a meta-analysis saying that, all these strength programs that we periodize don't make a difference in hypertrophy. So that may or may not be helpful. I think at the very least, we know that we need progressive overload, and that based on the requirements that we just discussed for volume, intensity, and frequency, you need to think about training configuration. And then since we're talking about hypertrophy on this channel, we're talking about a lot of competitive bodybuilders, powerlifters trying to make it to the next level by being bigger, and highly motivated individuals, we're going to need to think about fatigue management, and we're probably going to be pushing the boundaries of what is appropriate. So that means we're going to have some kind of cycling of different stimuli to just as a kind of a safe bet. So what that might look like, there's a lot of ways you can do it. You can pick a volume that you think is useful to start with someone, and then an appropriate frequency based on their schedule, how to divvy it up. So you're meeting kind of the requirements of at least 10 sets per muscle group, at least twice per week, and then matching the repetition ranges and zones based on one thing we didn't talk about before is certain exercises just aren't suited to high versus low rep training. Like you're not going to do 5s with curls, and you're not going to do 30s with deadlifts unless you're Doug Miller and you just like, screw it, I'm Doug Miller, I can do 30s on deadlift. But for the most part, like the heavy compound lifts, you're probably going to be hitting in that 6 to 12 range. And then a lot of your more isolation movements and your accessories, you can probably work in that 10 to 20 range for the most part. I think there's exceptions obviously, but that's a broad thing I could say. So that's how you'll set up your base structure, if that's kind of what your program looks like between volume, intensity, and frequency. How you progress it, that's the big question, because you don't just keep it static. You can certainly keep it static and just try to make incremental increases in load and reps, and I think that's fine, so long as it works. And there will be times where it does and doesn't work. For your first couple of years, it might work just fine. It might provide optimal progress. I'd even argue that it probably could. if you've gone through a cycle of heavy strength training and you come back to that, it might work very well. If you haven't touched all these isolation movements for a while, as a kind of a volume cycle, it might work just fine, just to progress load and reps incrementally when you can. But other times you're probably, based on your training age, you're not going to be able to actually see the needle move just trying to do that. So there may be other strategies you need to do. I know that Mike often will do an incremental increase in sets across the week. And I think that's certainly acceptable. You just need to be careful about that, because that, let's say you have doing 3 sets on everything from upper body workout and you go to 4, that's a 1/3 increase in the volume you're used to. So you have to kind of start on the lower end before you're going to start jumping up, instead of doing what most people would probably do, is start where it's already hard because they don't want to go lower than that ever, and then go up, which could cause problems. So you have to have a little bit of systematic intelligence, I would say, and awareness of what you can handle and where you should be before you start increasing sets like that. Other progression patterns that we've talked about before and that I often use will be a linear progression within a mesocycle. Linear meaning that the reps will go down as the weight climbs up. That way, instead of having to make an incremental increase in load every week, you can do something like having your 3x8 to go up every 4th week or something like that, by the smallest load increment, which is a little more appropriate as you get more advanced. Shifting in from mesocycles of low, moderate rep training to high rep training can also be useful, trying to just add reps, as that can allow you to, adding 1 rep from 20 to 21 is a much smaller percentage increase in progressive overload than going from 6 to 7. One's a 1/6 increase in strength, one's a 1/20th increase in strength, which might be equivalent of micro loading for reps, which I think is useful to do this high reps sometimes. So there's a lot of reasons to be going from different repetition ranges and different mesocycles. I don't know that one is necessarily wrong or better than the other. It just comes down to practicality. I often will follow a pattern where I'm doing that kind of linear progression for intermediates and within mesocycles, and then I'll sometimes use the increase in volume by adding sets for volume blocks for advanced lifters, and then I'll go to that declining setup during their intensity cycle. And then I think, is this going to come out before or after the deload talk?
This will be after. Deload, is a week today, a week this week, but not for when this comes out.
Okay, cool. So they will have already listened to our deload talk before they hit this. Mm-hmm. For fatigue management, which is part of periodization, everything we said there, insert into what I just said there, and now you have the fusion of the concepts. And I think that pretty much covers everything. Oh, okay. So here's a toughie. We kind of touched on this with training in different repetition ranges. And we have some not great data showing, we have theoretical reasons why you probably just don't want to stay in one repetition range all the time. And then we have, it as changing repetition ranges as a method to kind of manage fatigue or maybe prevent anabolic resistance, like Mike might say, also kind of theoretical, but makes sense. And then the one thing we didn't really touch on is that it's possible, this kind of goes into genotype, that different fiber type distributions or fibers might even respond differently. Like, sure, if you do a set of 30 to failure, you're going to end up recruiting everything, and you'll get to a point where you can no longer produce force to do rep 31. But we don't know if when those fast twitch fibers are cycled in to keep that force going, if they've been exposed enough of a stimulus by the end to get a similar training effect to if you did a 6 rep max, where they're going to be firing right from the start, staying in, and then doing as much as they can. Likewise, even though the sides principle tells us that when you do that 6 rep max, everything gets recruited from the start, there may not be enough time for those slow fatiguing, slow twitch fibers to get trained by a 6 RM. We don't know if that's the case. And I would say right now, the data wouldn't even actually indicate that. There was a study that came out last year, and it looked at the cellular response to doing basically AMRAPs with 80% or a very low percentage, maybe 30%, I'm not sure. And they were not different in terms of the actual cellular processes of hypertrophy. However, 80% is not really this was like a leg extension. So they did like 18 reps on their first set on average. So it was like 18 versus like 50 or something crazy. So it wasn't like 6 versus 30, which is something I'd love to see. So maybe it doesn't matter, but at the same time, we're also analyzing these at a group level. Like maybe if we did a biopsy of everybody and then did like quartiles and looked at changes of like who's the most fast twitch, who's the most slow twitch, and how do they respond in those, instead of just looking kind of at broad group level, you'd see something. So I think for a lot of reasons, it makes sense to train in different repetition training zones, even if, let's say, 2 out of those 3 hypotheses are incorrect, and they are actually the same. Whether you do a 6RM, a 30RM, everything gets trained. And let's also say that getting stronger doesn't help you get bigger, because maybe as the fiber grows, it's the same rough tension distribution over the fiber. Then still, for adherence, injury prevention, fatigue management, a lot of things, you probably want to at least split it up a little bit. It might look a little different. Like let's say that hypothesis I just gave was true, and those 2 things are not happening. Maybe you could train you could have cycles of 8 to 12 training and 12 to 15 training, and you'd never need to go heavy. Sure, you'd still want to vary your rep ranges a little bit for those reasons, and progression is easier in higher reps, and coming back down to get a little more neural efficiency, and maybe capillary density from the higher rep stuff. I could see there's still an argument to switch it up. So I think regardless, that should be a portion of your quote unquote periodization as well, training across a spectrum of rep ranges. And I think that covers everything.
Perfect. No, it's really nice to hear. And I think a big takeaway for the listeners is as you get more advanced, periodization probably has more of a role, and a big role is fatigue management. I think that's key. And you kind of talked about it. Everyone has talked about it with the reps in reserve and how important that is. And then the deload, when people listen to that, they'll understand how important that aspect of training is as well. And I do want to pass it over to Menno to hear if you've got any other different thoughts on how you might periodize for hypertrophy, whether you have any different ways of doing this for your clients.
Mm-hmm. I'll start off with one slight tangent, in that's related to some of the topics we discussed, including periodization. One thing that is very difficult about the exercise science literature, and why this is literature where it's very important to read the exact methods, although they're often not well reported, is that a lot of studies just claim very easily all sets were taken to failure, and they are very unclear about whether progressive overload was pushed and whether the trainees were motivated for it. So a lot of studies will say, we increased the load whenever they hit 12 reps, but did they actually tell the participants, you got to aim for more reps or more weight? Because if you don't, a lot of people will sort of stay in their comfort zone, and you don't aim for progressive overload at all. That, kind of renders the whole program invalid for for more advanced trainees at least. And the training to failure issue is, as Mike alluded to, a lot of studies are like, yeah, we did 4 sets of squats to failure. And I'm like, that's the point where I'm calling bullshit, because they're like, these studies subjects. We recruited 23 elderly untrained participants or some recreationally active women, and they're like, yeah, we have them squat to failure. No way. No way. Squatting to failure is, I can count on like one hand the amount of people that I see just being able to squat truly to failure. Like not just, I have a fair amount of clients that are pretty hardcore and will dump the barbell because they know this will be a grind from hell to get the weight up, but they could probably do it. But truly hitting failure, actually trying and failing, doing like a leg press or a squat, that is excruciating. So it's really questionable in all these studies what the level of effort and true proximity to failure and periodization was. That aside, I think I fully agree with Eric about all the main points. I like to use daily undulating periodization as my most used periodization methods probably, because the 2 studies that point to periodization having positive effects, one by Brad Schoenfeld and the other by, not sure what the name was, but they had daily undulating periodization, linear and no periodization. Brazilian research, I'm quite sure. And they found that linear had a slight trend of outperforming the no periodization group, and the daily undulating periodization group had a well, I think a 0.2 effect size greater, like 0.5 versus 0.7, which is substantial for advanced trainees, like practically relevant. So, but most research doesn't really find any benefit. But as Eric said, there's a multitude of reasons why you still want to at least rotate through rep ranges or alternate them. So I like that a lot, daily undulating periodization. I think weekly undulating is a bit weird because then you have possibly 2 or more sessions with the same rep range, and then you switch to a different rep range, and then next week you do the same. So you don't really take advantage of the possible fatigue management you get if you sandwich workouts closely together but have different rep ranges. If you try to do like that study I mentioned with training frequency, if you try to do the same exercise for the same amount of reps day in, day out, then you very quickly get stuck in practice. And once you're past the novice level, at least. Linear periodization, I like it for powerlifters, like increasing the intensity, sort of as a taper for the meet, and the very few Olympic weightlifters and CrossFit trainees I work with. Not really for bodybuilding. I'm not very sold. I think the literature there is like really, really unconvincing. Auto-regulation is a big thing I think is important for periodization. There are still a lot of periodization studies and practitioners that sort of try to make a whole program 2 months in advance, everything planned out neatly, and it looks great, and it may work on average really well, but there's a lot of individuals who, if you do the programming like 80% times 3 reps, that it will just be too light, and for other people that may actually be close to failure. So I think that really does not take into account the individualization aspect, which is, I think, as I'm getting more experience as a coach, becoming more and more convinced that is really important, especially for the people the sort of hard gainers, where they come to you and they're like, they tried the standard stuff and it didn't work, and it seems they actually respond differently, or they need like a pretty significantly different approach than the average person. So I think that's important. Strategies like repetitions in reserve, or noting the proximity to failure, deloads, like the last topic, or reactive deloading, like auto-regulatory volume training. I think we also discussed that in that podcast. So these kind of strategies, and aiming for progressive overload, that's really important. And a lot of the other periodization is just whatever works, as Eric said, to facilitate progressive overload. Because there's one thing, if you're not getting stronger on the exercise in your program, you can be pretty sure you're not getting bigger. Like it's very possible to get stronger but not bigger, because it's just neural adaptations. But if you're not getting stronger, then it's highly unlikely you're getting bigger, because all else equal, a higher muscle cross-sectional area means higher force output. So that probably means you're not getting muscle growth either. So whether you actually do gain muscle growth when you change the program and gain more strength is not certain, but you are damn certain you're not going anywhere if you're just stuck and not changing anything.
Perfect. And I don't know if, Mike, you have any different thoughts on any of that. And if not, then we can talk about kind of just the final thing I would like to touch on is kind of making sure you're making progress. So Men has already touched on kind of getting stronger as an element of assessing whether you need to change anything. So yeah, I'll let you kind of touch on your periodization thoughts, Mike.
Yeah, real quick. Just a couple thoughts. The fiber type hypertrophy studies, where we try to find out if different fiber types hypertrophy differently based on different loading. A little bit of a waste of time in the untrained, because we know pretty well already from a lot of data that the untrained are usually maxing out their adaptive response anyway. And it's really difficult to believe that you're going to notice differences when fiber types are all being so super stimulated relative to their potential for growth. So, sets of 30 may very well maximize both fast and slow twitch fiber hypertrophy, or faster and slower. Or beginners, from whom everything maximizes fiber hypertrophy of all kinds, or intermediate and advanced individuals, I'm not inclined to assume that that's the case, though it may be, but I don't think that's very good evidence for that. So we just have to point that out, that, again, there's huge limitations of studies on the untrained, and inferring fiber type is one of those. In case anyone ever doubts the limited power of untrained studies, there's actually a literature review, and I can send it out, that shows that aerobic training gives similar muscular size adaptations to resistance training. it's a real review, real inclusive, actually a very good review in the sense that it includes plenty of relevant studies. And it turns out if you just run people on a treadmill when they were super beginners, they grow a lot of muscle. So it becomes really, difficult to conclude a whole lot difference-wise, especially with fiber types, because you literally get fast twitch fiber growth in those individuals. Fucking running, how the hell are you jogging? How the hell are they doing that? Well, when you haven't never walked around for longer than 5 kilometers, it starts to be very interesting for you to jog at all, and your fibers are like fuck, so it's totally maxed out. So just really quick to touch on a couple of things. I think that there's definitely a good argument for varying rep ranges within the microcycle. So the DUP type of thing is, I think, good. I think that there's also a good reason to vary rep ranges between mesocycles for at least one reason, other than psychology and adherence, which is good, a good reason, is that if you train really, really heavy, sets of sort of 6 to 10, and you accumulate quite a bit of damage to connective tissues, not damage that's bad as necessarily, but could get out of hand if you continued. I think because we know that damage like that to connective tissues with poor circulation takes not days but weeks to heal, I think phases of higher repetitions, lighter weights without a lot of heavy training in them should last a mesocycle or longer. So I think while it's totally cool to have variation within the week of, let's say sets of 8 and sets of 20 in the same week, I think there has to be mesocycle variation as well. Also, especially for more advanced individuals where you may train in the 6 to 12, rep range for 3 mesocycles in a row and take at least 1 mesocycle after that, maybe in the 20 to 30 rep range or something like that. And then what that allows you to do is really back away from a real connective tissue disruption that's more significant and heal up while you still get hypertrophic benefits. I think that kind of thing is a good idea. I don't think it goes far enough. So I think every now and again, a much lower volume phase is probably a good idea for a couple of reasons. So one, I think there's a resensitization effect and definitely a fatigue management effect, but that's been pretty well covered. I'm inclined to believe that there is a resensitization effect for a couple of reasons. One, psychology, where you can only push it and train super hard long enough until you need a pretty extended break of not pushing it hard. The more advanced you get, the longer these breaks tend to need to be because training is harder. I think there's a pretty convincing line of reasoning to think that you can transition fiber types within the period of a mesocycle or so to some small extent from slower acting to faster acting. And because faster twitch fibers tend to hypertrophy more, I think that when you do a very much lower volume phase with higher intensities, of course, that you can do some fiber transitioning during that phase. And when you come back and start pumping up the volume after that, you can actually get for a short time higher levels of higher levels of growth for a short time. It's just making race car noises in your own mouth. So so basically, like if you do low volumes for long enough, I think you can get some fiber conversion and basically experience the growth effects of a slightly more fast twitch individual for several weeks at least coming back. Also, we know that metabolites through whatever pathway, whether it's tension-based or otherwise, have an effect. We also know that if you train with high volumes long enough, you get a lot of really good peripheral vasculature, and it lowers your ability to, at any one given volume, exhibit the generation and sequestration of lots of metabolites. So I think if you go through a lower volume phase and you come back, and we've all experienced this, you get super crazy mega pump and super crazy metabolites because you're like, oh my fucking God, I'm not in shape to do this anymore. And that's actually maybe a good thing in a sense because you can get a better metabolite load at lower volumes. And then lastly, this hasn't been mentioned yet, but the muscle pump itself or intracellular swelling has been pretty convincingly connected to muscle growth. And I think that you get way better pumps after a lower volume phase than before, again, through some of those same capillary factors and fiber conversions. So if you come back after a lower volume phase with a slightly faster twitch fiber type, slightly poorer vascularization, I think you're apt to get better pumps. And I think those better pumps make you grow more muscle just by a teensy little bit. So I think if you're any beginner or intermediate, I think this kind of periodization is probably a good bit of a waste of your time, especially if you do it too often. As you become more advanced, I think there's a pretty decent argument along those lines and a couple others that every now and again, a month or so of much lower volume, basically strength training, is a good idea to resensitize. If it turns out that strength training enhances hypertrophy later on, this is just going to be a closed case. But it's not, that's not so clear yet. So I think it's still, with those factors I mentioned, I'd bet that it's a good idea to do, a low volume phase every now and again. If you add in the fatigue management effects, I think every 6 months to a year for more advanced individuals, a month or so, at least a couple weeks of significantly lower volumes, are probably a good idea.
Cool. And I think we might have touched on that in the deloads kind of podcast where you talked about active recovery phases. Otherwise, we've definitely covered it in podcasts with you before, Mike. So I think that's brilliant. I know Menno has to leave fairly soon, so I do want to just make sure that Menno said his piece and everything that you wanted to say. So if you have any kind of comments on what Mike said there.
Yeah, I'd add that I'd agree that there is decent support for the idea that you can get fiber type specific hypertrophy. It's not consistent by any means, as Eric said, but there's one study from Popov in Russia, and I think two more in Russian that found specific type 1 growth at higher reps and more type 2 growth at lower reps. And Brad Schoenfeld's meta-analysis found a trend for the same, but it was only at the 90 and the 30% range. So when you really go to the outer ends of the hypertrophy zone, that you induce preferential fiber growth. And we do know from a long time from Fly's review that bodybuilders have more growth in the type 1 fibers than powerlifters and Olympic weightlifters. So that's at least cross-sectional evidence that it may be possible to preferentially recruit and grow the type 1 fibers with higher reps. So I think that there is something there, but it's by no means major. And based on Schoenfeld's meta-analysis, it probably requires really going to the ends of the hypertrophy range where you get these specific effects. Like it won't be much of a difference between 8 and 9 reps. One other thing that actually I haven't mentioned is that at Beijing Bodybuilding we're conducting a meta-analysis on training volume, but we're reanalyzing it. We have two. One finding is really cool, I think, because for the first time we can actually show that the dose response differs between untrained and trained individuals, which is something that coaches have been saying for decades. But if you actually look at the lines for the effect size plots, like they're pretty dissimilar. It's very obvious that it's not the same dose response. So that's a cool finding. And of course, the other thing is that we're trying to tease out the end of the optimal amount of sets, but we're actually reanalyzing that, because if you look at the more advanced trainees, you actually get kind of shockingly high numbers in terms of the effect sizes that seem to sort of progress like more or less linearly, like in the 20-30 set zone, but that involves some cross-sectional comparisons. So there's the more direct one from the German volume training study, and I think it's been replicated as well already, but not published, that found if you the German volume, the 10x10 group actually gained less muscle growth than the 5x5 group. So if you calculate the amount of sets in that study, you're looking at something like 30 or in the high 20s for the 10x10 group, at least for some of the muscles, depending on which muscle you look at. So that's some evidence against this idea, but I look forward to sharing that at least. But I can't say much more about it now because, like I say, we have to reanalyze it.
Awesome. No, really interesting. And I can't wait for that to come out as well as I'm sure all the listeners as well. So yeah, thank you, Menno. And if you do need to go at any point, feel free to leave. And the other guys can decide whether they want to hang on and say anything else or leave as well. But Mike's got something to say, so I'll hand over to Mike.
Menno, I'm really excited about your review, and as you guys are doing a bang-up job over there. There's a study that I'm involved with currently as a dissertation committee member that is designed to find people's MRV, and I can't say too much about it, and I'm not sure if we found it, but if we got close, it's fucking high. It's higher than I would have died if I was a subject participant. I would have simply deceased. But I also think that there is just as a tangent, there's a very big difference between a volume you can creep up to, hit, and back off versus a sustainable volume. Because whether you use the sustainable volume approach of Eric and you modulate more intensity, or whether you use my alternating volume but coming back up and down, it gets about the same average, or Menno's method of microloading and staying really close to this one thing, I don't think any of us are advocating up here. That's really important, because as soon as that study that I'm involved with is going to come out, people are going to be like, sweet, I can do 35 sets a week and not die. And it's like, yeah, for a week, totally. For 2 weeks, half of you will die. At 3 weeks, all of you will, you know what I mean? So it's one of those things and it comes down to, interpreting the research. And there's, I think, maybe not an ethical thing involved, but I think when a lot of people have their, fitness websites and stuff, like Menno, for example, whenever he does a write-up on a study and I repost it, half the people comment on Facebook are like, TLDR, bro. I'm like, I'm going to murder you. I'm going to come to your house and beat the fucking shit out of you, because there is no TLDR. There is that much nuance. So I'm just going to fuck with people who say, TLDR, train as much as you can. And I'm just going to link them to that one guy on Instagram that says that, because of the nuance involved, we got to be really clear about this. And I think it's on evidence-based folks that are sharing these studies, et cetera, discussions, to do like a Menno-esque job in describing them, because the devil is often very much in the details, and what you can peak to is not the same fucking thing that what you can do for, 10 weeks or even 3 weeks. What do you guys think about that?
No, I would agree. Like in mass, our research review, we try to make it as short as possible when we review a study. It's still not that short, So yeah, and no, I would totally agree. There's a huge difference between the maximum amount of volume you can do for a short period of time, and that's the whole reason overreaching is a thing, right? And the sustainable amount of volume one can do. So I would echo that 100%.
I'm actually not sure if it's muscular, but I do think there's a discrepancy in the connective tissue and muscular possible recovery capacity. Because I think when a muscle can recover from a certain volume, actually it can recover and supercompensate. It can recover from that this session, but also the next session. But it doesn't mean that your connective tissue has recovered as well, because you can still get stronger. Your muscle may have gotten bigger, but underneath the tendon may be degenerating. So until the tendon actually degenerates to the extent that it's manifests a strength loss, you won't notice that. So I think that is a big reason for the need to, like Mike said, maybe do higher rep phases or periodize. So the take home is the same, but I just don't think it's muscular.
Perfect. And I don't know if you guys want to touch on briefly kind of ways of assessing whether you need to make a change, so whether the program's worked for you. I don't know if Menno's got time enough to summarize whether how your program's working, whether you need to make a change before you leave.
All right. So I got 2 minutes. You sort of gave the Cliff Notes answer. If it works, you may want to change it, optimize it a bit, but don't fix what isn't broken. And if it doesn't work, definitely change it, because I think actually writing an article about reasons my online coaching won't work for you. And one of the top reasons is you're not willing to change anything. There are some people that they want different results, but they want to keep doing the same thing. And that's not going to happen. If you do the same thing, you're going to get the same results, because nature is kind of merciless like that. So I think for a program, that is the big key. And a lot of things as well, like people ask me, how low should I go in body fat percentage? Well, we know that there is a low end where you don't want to go below, because it will, have reduced anabolic hormone levels and the like, but it varies a lot between individuals. I have some clients, they are shredded as fuck, like all year round, and they feel fine. They have good libido, they make good strength gains, they never get injured. And I'm like, you lucky motherfucker. But other people, when they get to six-pack level range, they already start having libido problems and the like, and you see their strength progression wane. You can see in the ratio, for example, of caliper to weight, which I really like, especially if someone gets too fat to the high range, where chronic inflammation, nutrient partitioning, aromatization to estrogen, those kind of factors may come into play. You see that they very easily gain weight, but the calipers go up a lot. So it's almost impossible for them to still gain weight without fat as well, which indicates to me that they're probably not lean bulking very efficiently. So it's more these factors that I look at, and especially strength gains. Okay, I got 0 minutes. One thing that I pay a lot of attention to is strength, because in my experience, I'm going to be a little crude here, but most other means of progress just don't work very well in my experience. Like density training and stuff, it all sounds really nice on paper, but in my experience, if you just don't get people a lot stronger, it doesn't really tend to show up in muscle growth. So a lot of programs over the course of a year, if you look at the photos before and after, and 1RMs in strength, not much has really changed. Like they've built up work capacity or those kind of things, but in the end, it's strongly my experience that if you get someone really strong without, a true powerlifting program, just get them strong at accessory lifts and everything, they will grow. But any other means of progress are more hit or miss. And that's it. I gotta go to my consult. I'm out. You can discuss that, and I'll see what you have to say about it later.
Cheers, man.
See ya.
I cannot wait to talk some massive shit about Menno now.
Every time. So I don't know.
He'd never leave.
I don't know if Mike, you want to touch on kind of how you're assessing progress, whether you need to make a change. If you got any comments on kind of what Menno said there.
Yeah, he said some good stuff. So the strength measurement stuff is 100% on the money. I'll just say one thing, you don't have to do formal RM testing because you should be hitting one from fail every month or so anyway in your programming. So automatically, like your peak week numbers, you should be writing at least those down in your journal and comparing them over the mesocycles and over the years. There's a really important argument there for good technique and standardization of technique, which is why I bent row to the floor and all the way to the tummy and don't cheat, because I want to know if my back's getting bigger. Motherfucker's hard to see back there, and pictures only do so much. So it's good standardized technique and you're getting stronger. I think the kind of strength that most reflects hypertrophy is a little fiber type dependent, but in the 6 to 20 rep range, or even maybe 6 to 30, for multiple sets especially, because I think work capacity and muscle size have a lot of crossover. You can see this in cyclists. Velodrome cyclists have incredible work capacities and gigantic quads and so on and so forth. So I think that what you can do for one set is important and correlated to hypertrophy, like a set of 10, but your 5 by 10 or something like that, or your 5 sets, how many reps total you can get at whatever weight, I think that is really well correlated. So show me a guy that can bench, 365 pounds for 8 versus a guy that can bench 405 for 8. The 405 for 8 guy will probably have a bigger chest. But show me a guy who over 4 sets can do 40 reps with 405 versus a guy that can do 20 reps with 405, and the 40 rep guy is going to have fucking bigger pecs every time. We also see this particularly with bodybuilders versus powerlifters. A bodybuilder is not necessarily stronger than powerlifters for sets of like 5 and stuff, and even sometimes for sets of 10. But bodybuilders can just fucking keep doing sets of really fucking heavy weight. It's really impressive. So like if you're inclining 405 pounds for sets of 10, there's no way you don't have big pecs, just plain and simple, right? But if you bench 500, some of those guys have like deceptively smaller pecs than you would think. You try to get them to do some volume work, and it looks like their volume capacities aren't that great. So I think the ability to do heavy volume over multiple sets is really what correlates with hypertrophy the best of our weightlifting or our strength measures at the gym. I think that's the most important point to pay attention to. It also gets folks away from doing crazy RMs like, all right, last time I hit 315 pounds for 12 6 months ago, I got to hit it for at least 16, and they start to break down their technique or grind shit because it's just all one set. I mean, it's a minor issue. It takes, you can just solve that issue with a good hard talking to and tell people not to do that. But I think when you tell them, look, just do multiple sets, one rep from failure, and we'll take a look at the result after, it's at some point you kind of realize, oh, wow, I really am what bodybuilders call handling the weight a lot easier. You know what I mean? It's just do more reps over time. And then just real quick, There's a lot of ways to measure, so the way to measure maximum recoverable volume, if you're interested in not just progress, but what to do about it. So let's say you're not progressing. Maybe you're training over your MRV too often. So what is your MRV? Well, if you get to a certain level of volume and your performance in that same multiple sets range starts to fall every time you get to, let's say, 20 sets of back work, and every time you go over 20, your performance starts to slide. It's probably not productive for you. Your MRV is around 20. It's probably not productive to train more, right? But another question we'd be getting a lot at RP Plus is, how do you tell what your minimum effective volume is, right? Where to start your mesocycles, or maybe let's say you're injured or your fatigue is really high and you want to know, okay, I still want to bring up this body pressure, still want to train it, but I don't want to push it as hard as I know it can go. Maybe I could push it a little lower and still get good results. Or at the very least, how do I put it on the back burner? Because, you don't want to put something on the back burner and have it cool off completely. It's too little volume. So how do you tell your minimum effective volume? There's a good series of 3 proxy measurements and 1 definite measurement. A definite measurement is you do multiple mesocycles of it in a row with a certain low volume, like 10, and you measure performance at the throughout and at the end of that. And if performance gained a little bit, clearly it's above your minimum effective volumes by definition, right? But if it's stabilized, then it's like sort of maintenance volume, or it's below your minimum effective volume for sure. And if it went down, well, then that's below maintenance volume, right? But that's pretty hard to do, and especially if you're not de-emphasizing any body parts, you're not going to run 3 mesocycles in a row intentionally at minimum effective volume, because you could just be getting better gains. So I think every mesocycle that you start out and try to work up, from your minimum effective volume to your maximum recoverable, a cool sort of 3 proxy method is, are you getting sore? How are you working relatively hard, and are you getting a pump? So for example, in that first week where you're trying to hit minimum effective volume, or you're trying to find yours and you don't want to go through that whole long measurement process, let's say you do something that's above your minimum effective volume, or at it. Let's pretend that that's 10 sets a week. Let's say you do 10 sets a week. You look back over the week. You go, okay, was I getting pumps? Yes or no? Like a fucking pump. Was I getting sore at all? And am I, like, after these workouts that I'm doing, or the whole week together, was there a perception that I'm putting in some decent work? Like, I'm working pretty hard, not super hard, just like, am I making an effort? If the answer to all 3 of those is no, like imagine you did a program and you got no soreness whatsoever, which is okay by itself. It doesn't relate to growth that predictably at all. But you got no pump, like you literally never had a pump in the gym, and you felt like you were just breezing through everything and you just were never trying. I'd be willing to bet that's below your minimum effective volume. There's just no evidence of an effect whatsoever that you're just any physiological disruption whatsoever that you're growing muscle. If a couple of those are there and one isn't, you're probably around your minimum effective volume. If all 3 of them are there at minimum, then you're at or above your minimum effective volume. And for sure, if it's a religious effort, if you're getting super fucking sore and or your pumps are wild, I mean, you're clearly just way above your minimum effective volume. So that's how I would use those proxy measures. So if anyone's listening is kind of interested in that question of how do I know I'm doing enough? Well, if you can check some of those boxes, and not all of them, like you can never be sore. But if you're like for back training or delt training, you just never get sore. The muscle is just not designed in a mechanical way that's just going to get DOMs unless you do crazy volume over your MRV. Are you getting pumps? And are you perceiving like you're doing like a bit of effort? If yes, then you're probably doing enough, right? But if you can, the big one is if you can say with all 3 of those no, then man, I just wouldn't bet you're doing enough to grow unless you have good evidence from long-term tracking otherwise that demonstrates that. So there's my piece on that.
No, brilliant. I think that's really helpful, especially kind of it's quite an easy thing for people to conceptualize kind of the minimum effective volume and go into the gym and really kind of analyze that for themselves. And as we know, you need overload to produce hypertrophy. That's kind of a given. So if it's not hard at all, then yeah, there's something.
Right. It's like the fundamental question of all 3 of those proxies is kind of leading to the one big question of, are you getting a workout? Yeah. Do you feel like you're getting a workout? If the answer is like, no, never, and you're honest, then man, yeah, I just wouldn't bet anyone past and beginner is going to grow from anything like that.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. And Eric, have you got any other thoughts on kind of measuring using strength as a tool? I know within the muscle and strength pyramid, you kind of utilize some tools within there.
Yeah, I think strength is probably 90% of what I pay attention to, and then subjective markers of recovery after that. And there's a lot of ways to do that. Yeah, I think I've advocated AMRAPs many times, and I think that's useful because it's a nice systematic way to know that you're getting stronger. But the reality is if you're getting stronger in your training loads, you already know. So AMRAPs are an optional tool, which is something that will probably be changed in my second edition of the books, just because I think people get really hung up on that one number, and they do weird stuff as they lead up into it.
Can I deload before my AMRAP test? And you're like, no. And they're like, but I want to do well. I'm like, I understand that, but that's not, anyway, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, because so much hangs on it emotionally, they make odd decisions. So yeah, I think the only time it's difficult to see whether you're progressing is in your training loads is when you're relatively advanced. And then I think you have to look at, maybe you do a mesocycle of higher volume training where you're just kind of, your performance is doing this basically because you're fatiguing yourself. And then when you go into your next mesocycle, when you drop your volume down, you should have an imbalance to recovery and fatigue, favoring recovery, but not to the point where you're detraining. And then you should start to actually see some progress as you're lifting heavier loads. And yeah, that's probably the equivalent for a more advanced lifter. And that can or doesn't have to include AMRAPs, but I think for an advanced lifter can probably get away with AMRAPs because they're going to be, with their experience, they're going to be less ridiculous about the decisions they make around AMRAPs, and they're going to be able to do it in a more consistent state. And they've had a little more time in the game just to not bet their whole life on a single day or even a single set. So I think that's where I would probably still use those. And then I would say that the proxies Mike gave, I would just caution people to make sure that other things are also held static for you to be comparing those. Like you go in a calorie deficit, or if you're cutting, or if you go low carbs all of a sudden, or if you're eating super clean and your sodium goes down, you're just not going to get it. Like you don't get pumps during prep at a certain point. It almost doesn't matter what you do.
But I would say that also means you're not growing because you don't grow during prep either.
This is true. Well, maybe you don't know. Okay. But yeah, so if you just be aware that if your nutrition is all over the place, or if you're, and also that the context of all those different measures you mentioned, they should be within when your other training variables are fixed. Like if your frequency and intensity are training, if your frequency and intensity are changing, and you're trying to gauge your appropriate volume level, how can you do that? You know, because 10 sets of 5 is way different than 10 sets of 20 in terms of stressing different things and what you can recover from. So I would just caution that the more of a proxy measure you use, which I would say even strength is actually a proxy measure, the more you need to make sure that you're comparing like to like, just to get my scientist out there. So.
Perfect. No, I really like that. An assessment of kind of strength gains within the hypertrophy rep range, or the traditionally thought hypertrophy rep range, and specifically kind of volume PRs. And I don't know if you guys have heard, James Krieger has spoken about
kind of Sigma nutrition.
Yeah, for isolation movements. So kind of using those, because obviously there's no neurological kind of efficiency there. So I thought that was a really interesting kind of insight from James.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys, I really want to see that paper come out, but I believe James said that looking at like basically the total work done over multiple sets on isolation movement had the highest correlation to hypertrophy, which makes a lot of sense when you think about it. You can only get so good at a machine curl, right? And yeah, it combines both factors of greater force production from a larger fiber, and also the ability to buffer fatigue from all the other stuff that comes with hypertrophy. So,
Perfect. I think that might be a wrap, unless you've got anything else to say, Mike or Eric. Or...
Oh, I've got lots. I've got days of shit to say, my friend, and I use the term friend sarcastically. Yeah, I don't know,
I'm good.
Steve, if you want to wrap that up, I'm good.
I will say thank you to you both, and goodbye to the listeners, and welcome any comments or questions from them as well.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Steve.